Hey there, this is Ocean again. Um, I just want to talk about why, in my opinion, I should look at the camera. I always forget that. Why, in my opinion, John Bernthal is not a good casting choice for the Punisher. And like to be clear, I do like him. Like I like him as a character, but to me, he feels more like an alternate sort of like Elseworlds type of um, version of the Punisher. Even though a lot of his origin harkens back to his original origin when compared to the Thomas Jane and the Ray Stevenson movies. Well, the Ray Stevenson movie was pretty accurate, but still. Um, I think the problem I have more so that makes it feel Elseworlds to me is just the casting choice of John Bernthal himself. And it's because I have no problem with the way John Bernthal acts in general. I just don't think it fits the Punisher as well as it could. And I'm not saying he's like a dumpster fire of a Punisher, but I don't think he's the best choice. Um, and my main issue is that he's a very, very weepy actor who does a lot of Oscar baiting every single role that he's in. He's constantly weeping and crying and blubbering, and like that is just not the temperament, the personality, or the temperament of Frank Castle, of the Punisher. It just isn't. Um, if you look in comic panels, if you look in like there's one animated movie that he was in, um, that and again, in every single iteration I've seen of him, whether it's comic form or animated, he's very stoic. He keeps the same face most of the time. He's not this like scrunched up guy who screams when he fights or cries and blubbers a lot, who's super emotional. He's an old-fashioned type of man. You know, his original version, you know, he was literally in the Vietnam War. So he's a very old-fashioned type of guy who wouldn't let himself cry around other people the way John Bernthal's does. He's constantly welling up in tears, even in front of his enemies. And I have no problem with a man crying, like in general. I just don't think it fits a character like the Punisher. A Punisher. The Punisher is a very old-fashioned, traditionally masculine type of character, in my opinion. He's old fashioned. He has an old fashioned sense of like what it means to be a man, and of course he is because he's a very like one track minded kind of person. I got to kill all the bad people because they're all bad, right? So it makes sense that he would be that way. But again, John Bernthal is a very good actor. I just don't think that the way he emotes when he acts fits the Punisher. Um, I think Thomas Jane fits it a lot better because again, if you look back in the comics, like I haven't read Punisher Max all the way through, but like if you look back on it, like there's a most like of the time when his expression when he's getting things done, when he's killing, when he's maiming, it's very stoic. He's a very stoic character. That's something that's very consistent with Frank over a lot of different iterations. Is that he's a very stoic character, and again, that fits with him being like a very traditionally old school, old fashioned masculine type of character. And there are moments when John Bernthal captures that, but most of the time he over emotes and makes it much like way too emotional, and that's just not how Frank Castle is, in my opinion. So even though some things were changed and amplified when in the Thomas Jane movie, and the Thomas Jane Punisher movie is my favorite Punisher. That's my favorite on-screen Punisher, my favorite Punisher story. It's way better than the Netflix Punisher TV show. That show was incredibly slow and bland and repetitive, and at times disappointingly unremarkable. Even though at the end of the day I still liked it, it was also disappointing at the same time, I would say, if I'm being honest. And even Ray Stevenson captured that temperament a lot better, where he's very stoic most of the time. But you know, if you've seen like any one of John Bernthal's movies, he's a very, very weepy actor. And tears are an interesting thing when it comes to acting. One, I just don't think it fits the temperament of the character of the Punisher, which I've brought up before. It makes him feel like an alternate version of the Punisher because what the Punisher is supposed to feel like, he's supposed to feel like this human equivalent of the Grim Reaper who is like blank behind the eyes and who's like a ghost who comes in and like he has no problem with killing you. He doesn't feel bad about it one bit. He doesn't have to scream to get himself through it. He doesn't have to cry to get himself through it. He's just cool with it. He maybe doesn't even enjoy it, but he's just cool with it because he has not that he has no soul, but there's just something empty inside of him. There's something that's gone. And Thomas Jane's performance really captured that. And so did Ray Stevenson. But even if you watch something like The Accountant 2, which is a whole other movie about an autistic accountant who's also an assassin, but in that movie, even in that movie, he plays a very weepy. And you know what? One of the most convincing roles that John Bernthal played was this role in uh, Sicario, where I don't remember exactly what his role was, but he was some type of double agent and he was trying to seduce Emily Blunt's character in that. But after he gets caught, like trying to take advantage of her, um, he starts weeping and crying and begging like a little baby. And not to say that I'm a tough guy, but that's just that it was intended to be like that, where he's like begging and he's kind of being like brutalized and tortured, not torture, but like, I mean, light torture. I wouldn't call it a torture scene, but he's getting like beat up by the cops for what he did, and they're trying to get information out of him, and he's kind of crying like a little baby, and that's how the character's supposed to be. He's kind of a coward, and that was one of the most convincing performances John Bernthal ever did because he's a very weepy actor. He's an actor who cries in almost every single movie that he's in. Like, it's kind of ridiculous. And it's just the contrast between him and other characters in the MCU. I just think it's problematic how emotional he is, because if you look at the comics, if you look at the cartoons, Punisher is always like much more stoic than most of the other characters, most of the other Avengers. But if you look at the MCU, if you take someone like Captain America, right, who's not nearly as gritty and as merciless as someone like the Punisher would be, he barely even cries in any of the MCU movies. And some of that's just Chris Evans acting, but it's like he only gets a little teary-eyed when Tony dies in Avengers Endgame. But he doesn't cry that much. And he's not as dark and as stoic of a character as Frank Castle is. But Frank cries almost every single scene that you see him in, man. And I'm not saying that a person who went through that in real life wouldn't necessarily do that. It just doesn't fit his character. It's not the way he emotes. It's not the way he exists. It's not his temperament. It's not the type of person he is. If anything, Ben Affleck is actually a better casting choice for the Punisher, because when he's played very vicious, like hard-lined characters, he's very stoic. And that's what Frank Castle's temperament is in the comics. Another problem I have with his Punisher, not directly related to his performance, is just kind of how Netflix handled the story in general, where they weren't really interested in establishing his role as a vigilante after he had resolved the situation regarding his the people who killed his family and getting revenge on them, to continue to seek justice more indiscriminately against evildoers, or not evil, against criminals who didn't directly hurt him, right? And that's really who the Punisher is, like when he gets into being a vigilante. But they were kind of very narrow-minded with the way they told it, and they kind of just wanted it to be this kind of narrow, contained, bordered off revenge story where he gets his revenge and then he's done. Gets his revenge and then he's done. Gets his revenge and then he's done. That's not how the Punisher is. He indiscriminately kills all the criminals, whether they are human traffickers, whether they are general murderers, serial killers. He goes after them all. And that's after he gets his revenge. But he doesn't just do the revenge and then he's done. He's not the equalizer. He's not a superhero, but he's an anti-hero. He's essentially a superhero in that he's a costume and that he's on a mission. And if you take that out, then he's not a Marvel character anymore. And it just doesn't really fit him. So the way they wrote him was, I felt, very sloppy too. And the reason why Thomas Jane is my favorite Punisher is not only because I think Thomas Jane played him the best and he really fit Frank's temperament and he really looked the most like Frank, is that they made changes to the Punisher story in the Thomas Jane Punisher movie that amplified the pain, that made it more unique, that made it more powerful. Because in that movie, not only does his wife and kids get killed, but his entire extended family gets killed. His uncle, his nieces, his cousins, his mother, his father, everybody. So they take away every single possible relief that he could have as far as familial support, right? So it's even more believable in that role that he would become the Punisher than any other Punisher that's portrayed afterward on the big screen. But yeah, I love Thomas Jane's Punisher, and I wish we would have gotten the second one of him. And if they ever came back and did like a Logan type thing, and when he was 60 years old, well, he's probably like 65 now. I would watch it because he's my favorite Punisher, and he's the only real Punisher to me. Like John Bernthal is my least favorite Punisher, and not because he's a bad actor, but because his temperament does not fit the personality of Frank Castle. He's an old-fashioned masculine guy who doesn't cry hardly ever, who keeps a stoic face, who shows that silent, unmoving strength. And strength can come in different forms when we're talking about objectively, but like narratively, it just doesn't work for that character because that's not originally how he was. But like when it comes to strength in real life, it's a complicated thing. Some people can be very, very fearful and teary, but they just know how to cry at the right times and use that and channel that. Like Mike Tyson used to cry, said that he used to cry before every one of his matches because he hated who he was going to become. And then there are other people who don't cry and they're very strong. But like it just depends on the context of the crying and stuff. And it's also that because John Bernthal is an excessively weepy actor, more so than any other actor in the MCU, including the actresses. um, it comes off as kind of weak, and I just don't think that fits the Punisher. Like with how much he's crying, it's like all the time, cry, 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 cry. It's like it's just too much. You can give him one. I think it would make more sense if you gave him like one or two crying scenes over the course of his entire runtime in Netflix and in Disney Plus. And when I say crying scenes, I'm also including the scenes where he's just getting choked up talking, including when he's in like Daredevil Born Again, when he's in front of the Punisher fanboys and he's getting choked up in front of his enemies. It's like, that's such a weak thing to do, to get all choked up and like act like you're going to cry in front of your enemies, the people you're going to kill. And it's also just not realistic. You're not going to cry in that moment if you're the Punisher, and if you're prepared to kill these people and you're about to. You're not in let's cry and break down mode and emotionally collapse mode. You're in we're on a mission, got to take all these guys out, got to take all their lives. But anyway, I wasn't really prepared for this video. I just kind of wanted to spit that out, and I've thought about that for a while. So yeah, have a good day, and I love you.